I'm off for my wee walk, and yeah, it's funny, you know, this new phone camera can see that, you know, I feel like I've aged 10 years because I can see so it's more detail. It's funny. It's the reality of life, isn't it? And yeah, I guess I was just thinking about, you know, because it's all kind of feeds together some ways, doesn't it? I was just on that video about IBS, and there's this element of like also this concept of like the body keeps the score, you know, as in the physical body. So that's also a book, so I would highly recommend that book. It's been helpful for me to read, and been helpful for clients of mine to read, and I can't remember how to pronounce the author's name, but if you type in "The Body Keeps the Score" trauma book, then you'll find it. It'll probably cost you about £4 or something, very cheap, worthwhile read. And you might need to equip yourself with like a grounding technique, or you know, some breathing techniques if you have a history of incidents and trauma. So it can be helpful to then ground yourself after you finish reading, you know, or during reading if needed, or use a breathing technique if you get upset and stuff. You could use one of the box breathing videos on mine if you needed to. But yeah, so there's this idea of you know, the body keeps a score, and it feeds into the thing of the high ACE score. So that's the Adverse Childhood Event Score, which is a thing that you can fill out yourself, and find that online as well. And it's this thing, isn't it, where if you've got a score above 3, basically, there's research shows that the higher chance of all sorts of physical health impacts and also social impacts. So that's things like heart problems, diabetes, problematic drinking, dysfunctional relationship outcomes, all sorts of stuff, yeah? Suicide risk, all sorts of things. And it's kind of like that thing, isn't it? If the trauma's left untreated, then it continually gets activated, and it's the same with all the kind of mental health difficulties in some ways. It's kind of untreated mental health difficulties has an impact on our physical health, you know, because they're kind of closely related and interdependent in some ways, you know. There's this impact on our physical health. I mean, I even feel it just now, you know, when I'm coming into the forest here. Yeah, so I'm just coming to the forest, and I instantly feel more chilled, you know. And the wind's died down, and I'm just in the forest. And that has an impact on my physiology, you know, my breathing changes. My body knows it can renew itself, you know. I take a little breath. So kind of like a recharge, you know, and a renew. But also when we're in fight and flight mode, our body's not in a repair process. It's not in a process that allows us to kind of heal, because we're actually prioritizing fight and flight, you know. It's like deprioritizing healing process, and also impacting all sorts of things. It's a really complicated impact, and you can look it up. You can look it up for yourself. And I'd highly recommend, with all of this stuff, to do your own research. Yeah. There's this aspect where I've managed to improve things for myself by doing huge amounts of my own research, spending time on that, looking things up, reading things, testing things out sometimes, little behavioural experiments, more noticing what's happening within ourselves, as in noticing what's happening within myself, and thinking, right, what am I feeling like just now? Right, what can I do about that? Could I change that up a little bit? What's going to help me to feel differently? What do I know I've done before that helps me feel differently? But anyway, so there's this aspect of the body keeps a score, and it kind of feeds into that thing, doesn't it? Of like, if I'd have not done anything about the IBS, and all sorts feeds into that, then the likelihood is that that's going to have an impact on my physical health long term, isn't it? Yeah. So it's the same with if we have a tendency to have catastrophic thinking. There's a doctor on my playlist, Perspectives playlist, that talks about how our thoughts directly change our physiology. Yeah, and I agree wholeheartedly with that. So if we think about something a certain way, we're changing our whole physiology of our body. Because it's that aspect, isn't it, sometimes where it's like we're getting ready to deal with something, a threat or something, yeah? And so it's remembering to take a breath, to be present, all those stuff like that, whole plethora of things really. But there's this other aspect where for example, when I went to get my knee looked at a few years back, they looked at it and they said, okay, it's fine, it just needs rest and stretching and all this, yeah? There's nothing directly wrong with the knee itself, it's more the ligaments and all of that, yeah? And the tendons and stuff, And I was like, okay. But what the radiographer or the person doing the x-rays said to me and showed me was that he said to me, did you have a bit, a significant illness in your childhood? Or something like that. Have you got a long-term health condition, And I said no, not that I can remember. And like you said, oh, you're not in hospital for a long period of time or anything like that, had some operations or anything? No. Because he said, you've got Harris lines on your bones. Yeah. And I was like, Harris lines on my bones? And he said, yeah, on your leg bones. He said, there's lines. And he said, that's, and this guy's a radiographer that's got plenty of experience on all this stuff, it's his bread and butter. He said it's linked to, the body being under a lot of stress and being ill, or sometimes being poisoned, or other things that's impacted your nutrition, or the way that you're able to kind of take nutrition from things, or that kind of stuff, And I was like, interesting. And then I looked it up afterwards, and there's debate about it a bit as well, because whatever. But generally, the idea is that it's a nutrient deficiencies and stuff like that, but also can be linked to stress and also illness and poisoning and all sorts, yeah. And these kind of serious illnesses and stuff, and it made me reflect on my mental state as a child, you know, and all the things that I went through, and also, you know, sometimes it was difficult in the winter time, you know, to get supplies in at times, you know, because of the heavy snow and things like that, you know. But there is this aspect where, you know, these things leave a mark on us, and it's kind of similar in some ways. You know, if we end up drinking a lot, or we end up chain smoking rollies like I used to do. You know, I used to chain smoke rollies without a filter and all that, you know, and heavily smoke cannabis and stuff, and these things will have all had an impact on me, you know, on my physiology, on my physical body, and often that could be argued, you know, is linked to your high ACE score, you know. Of course, there's just taking responsibility for things and all sorts. It's a complicated issue, but there's a higher likelihood of having these addictive behaviours and other problematic things going on, you know, and binge drinking and all sorts, which I used to do as well. So, you know, because it's sometimes about emotional regulation and stuff like that, and other things, but yeah, so there's this aspect where how do we make the best of it despite that impact, you know. And there's this element of like, well, first of all, it's treating the anxiety disorders, yeah, which generally can be done with things like EMDR or other talking therapies, yeah, and could be done with narratives. So before I did any training in anything, I just sat at a computer a couple of times at different times in my life, and I just literally started typing, yeah, and I had this like thoughts and all sorts jumping around my head, and I was all over the place, yeah, and I just sat on the computer at uni that one time, I think it was, and other times at different times, and I've written as well by hand in a notebook. But basically that time I just basically went and sat on a computer, opened up a Word document, and I just wrote everything that came into my head, yeah, and I just wrote everything that came into my head, and I had little breaks, but generally I would just be typing everything that came into my head about my thoughts that were bouncing around, and it was like, yeah, and I just kept typing like that. There was no real system to it other than it was directly related to what was going into my head. And then I did that for about a week or two, and I think I ended up with about something like 30,000 words or something. And strangely, it might seem, but not to me now, then I just kind of stopped doing it, you know. And something had helped there, you know. And it is in some ways this aspect of processing through writing and typing. You could do it, you know? And it's also this putting things outside of your head onto a piece of paper or onto a document. It helps you to have a bit of distance from it, but also you're doing exposure work to that, unpacking it more and making sense of it, you know, trying to make sense of it. So that was really helpful for me. I've done that multiple times, and I've also sometimes kept a journal or written down stuff, but yeah, and even in a sense making these videos that I make for YouTube now, all sorts of things come up, you know, that sometimes I don't mention, but it's an element of like, after I make it, things come up for me, you know, and I think about things afterwards and do further processing on things, or make sense of things a bit more, reflect on stuff, you know. and sometimes I'll play it back to myself just to review whether or not the sound is okay or stuff, or the music's right or whatever. And while doing that, I'll remember other things, you know. And sometimes I'm like, oh, I could have said that or done this, but also often it links to incidents or things that I had to deal with that were difficult, and then I can just reflect on that and just let it radiate a little bit, you know. And so even making these videos is a form of processing, you know, of things that I wasn't even really thinking about but come up, you know, when I think about that. And there's this element of, are we holding all of that inside of ourselves still sometimes, you know, even though it's not really conscious because we've not got the triggers in front of us as such, you know. Somebody's built a little hut here, which is a nice activity to do, isn't it? As in, they might be just doing that themselves, or they might be doing it with their kids, or it might be the scouts, I don't know, but it's pretty cool. Anyway, so there's this element of like making sense of things, and also trying to think about how we can negate the impact. So it's things like, you know, I do more walking and stuff, even though my knee ligament thing has got a weird issue. It's not been right since last Saturday when I did that 5-hour thing. But also sitting down all day in work, it's not good for it, you know. That's what messes it up, sitting down. Anyway, so there's this element where, like, now, as I'm getting fitter again, I don't want to slip back again in the future, you know. And I was looking at the definition on my legs, and it was just ridiculous this morning, you know. I just noticed it in the mirror thing when I was getting changed in the morning. I was like, oh my god, you know. So, but the thing is, I need my whole body to be like that. And what's happened is, you know, I've still got a belly, and I've still got, you know, unusual distribution in some ways, it feels like. But it's, I guess it's just the way fat sits genetically and individually. But so there's this idea of, like, you know, that's visceral fat from all of that in the past needs to go, you know. And so I'll be working on that, and you know, you could link that to high school, and you could link that to mental health type addictive issues and all of that. But there's this issue where I'm stuck at 116 kilos, and that's good, you know. I need to just notice that and say a good job to myself, which is important. But also I might need to drop a fast or two of like 2 or 3 days in there, just 2 or 3 days water fast, you know, a couple of times or something, or see how it goes. Probably do weights and swimming more. But this element of, like, trying to make sure that the underlying difficulties have been identified. Yeah, so it's like identifying the difficulties. That's the mental health difficulties and the impacts, the traumatic incidents, potentially, or say the depressive feelings or whatever it might be. And then treating that, you know, making sure it's not left untreated, and it being like an incremental progress thing, you know. And it's kind of then, for example, you know, if you're able to kind of then reassess and think, right, I've got these other priorities I need to make, you know, I've got priorities on my health, and I need to work on my physical health and getting as well as I can be, you know, because it's all interlinked as well, you know. But yeah, one of the methods that we use, some people more often than not, is to use psychometric measures, you know. And so these psychometric measures, you can type it in and to the internet, and they help clinicians to identify key thought processes or difficulties that somebody has, and target treatment on those things, you know, or have an impression of what the difficulty might be, you know. But it is also reliant on the clinician interpreting that psychometric test and also seeing the client and making sense of it together, as in understanding and assessing the client themselves, which is the key feature, isn't it? Where that clinician needs to make a judgment on that based on their understanding of variability and other factors that are at play in their reading of the situation and the person and the history and all sorts. But and it's things like the ADHD measure that's generally used quite often, the kind of indicative one at least. You know, it's nearly everybody's going to score to say that they've got ADHD, and it's just a bit like, is it a helpful measure or not, yeah. And so, yeah, it's a strange one. And I guess I'd mentioned previously that, that I'd had a whole plethora of mental health difficulties, and there's this aspect where psychiatrists would see it that generally, given my history, whenever I speak to them, they see it that I've got bipolar disorder, because I had a manic psychotic episode, generally, and also depressive episodes. So they see it in that context, but also that I've got a sensitivity to antidepressant medication, as in I can't take it really. And so and that varies with people can take it still with bipolar. And there's a whole bunch of issues where different clinicians say different things all the time, and they all have different views, but generally, they all very much think that that's the case. But I've not taken antidepressant medication or antipsychotic or mood stabilizer medication since 6 months to 9 months after I was psychotic, so it's about 21 years, yeah. So there's this aspect where we have more control over things sometimes than we think, and it's not, I don't think it's on my GP record that's what I'd have that diagnosis, and I don't generally kind of, I get it, but I don't generally agree with sometimes of course, diagnosis is a diagnosis, but there's this issue of diagnoses can sometimes not really tell the full picture, they're not very accurate sometimes, because often people's difficulties are cross-diagnostic, or things like, walking in the forest is my treatment as such, I'd happily take that medicine of walking in the forest, So yeah, it's everybody's got a choice on these things, and everybody can, there's so many clinical views on different things and all of that, but it is this aspect of, unless we kind of treat underlying trauma, because in my view it's like, and actually that was an indicative thing when I got treated for that psychotic episode. A lot of people that have had complex trauma, should I say, a lot of people that's had psychotic episodes and psychosis is often linked to them being traumatized, So in my mind it's a little bit like, well, what does the person look like if you treat the trauma and that's processed? And I would say, I'm quite different than when I was 21 or whatever it was that I was ill, I'm like in a sense, nearly like a different person, you know. And we are working on different things, but it's a bit like we change over time, you know. We change all the time, and we change over time, you know. And we can have incremental impacts on our physical health and our mental health by the choices that we make, and also seeking treatment, learning more about ourselves, what sets us off, or how we could think about things differently, and skilling ourselves up with a toolbox of things that work for us, you know. And we do actually change quite significantly over time, you know. I used to have really bad panic attacks, you know. I used to be stuttering, you know. In social situations, you know. I'd have really quite bad anger difficulties at one point, and you know, all just like OCD difficulties, you know. I mean, one thing with OCD difficulties is if you do get under stress again, you've got to be in some ways conscious of the tendency for these things to creep back in. And it's resisting doing the repetitive behaviours, or the checking behaviours, or the you know, things, the felt sense things where it makes you feel better, for example, you know? So there is this issue of like, not issue, but you know, sometimes I see it, you know, where there's history on the medical notes, and it's a bit like, can people see past the history on the medical notes, as in clinicians, but also the client themselves, you know? And can they see that things could be quite different in the future, you know? Which I think is very true, actually, from my own experience, and also from working with a lot of people. And it's this message of hope, isn't it? And actually noticing that things are dramatically different, you know. And it's a little bit like if they saw, if I didn't tell them anything, and I just sat in a room with somebody, they would not have an inkling, you know, that I had those difficulties. And that's quite interesting, isn't it? But anyway, have a good one. I know I've gone on for a while, but it is this idea of seeking treatment, treating underlying difficulties with your mental health, then having the benefits of that, reducing the impact on your physical health, and trying to do things to improve your physical health. Things like exercise can be really helpful, you know. This is as effective for mild to moderate depression as antidepressants are, and all this stuff, you know. So building self-awareness, understanding yourself better, and then doing things that you know are going to help, or learning about things that could help, you know. And thinking about The Body Keeps the Score is a good book to read for anyone, really, to be honest. But it's also equipping yourself with some grounding or breathing techniques if you need that, you know, if you've had a traumatic history. Okay, have a good one.